Hello, and welcome to another episode of On the Payroll, my podcast where I talk to my guests about things like leadership, project management, project delivery, consulting, Salesforce, and sometimes the conversation veers off into a more personal space. Today, I speak to Penny Townsend again. This is part 2. The first part, we focus on her professional journey. In today's episode, we dive a little bit more into the personal side of Penny, and we find out what interests her, like French cinema. We talk about personal resilience and people's belief systems, and some of the lessons she learned from some of the biggest, most painful mistakes in her life. And I always enjoy talking to people about the things that make them grow. And in the conversations I've had with Penny, actually, they're the conversations that made me grow. So I really enjoy this, and I hope you will too. Hello, Penny. Welcome to part 2 of our recording on my podcast called On the Payroll. I thought it was a cool name a long time ago, but it stuck. So how are you this morning?
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a really cool name, and I'm great. Thank you, Pei. Yeah.
I had so much fun the last time. We were talking about quite a lot of things, but when we came to a close, I thought, hey, there's so much more that I wanted to talk to you about. And so, ta-da, part 2. Let me begin with a couple of things. One was, you mentioned off camera that you are currently doing night classes. You mentioned the last podcast that you did, I thought it was ages ago, but it sounds like you're not busy enough. You've got to do full-time work, be a mom, and oh my goodness, I want to do something at night. Tell me about this night classes you're on.
Yeah, well, it's something I say to loads of people, is that continuing education is super important. And I was forever telling the young people at Presido to start doing it, because if you can start like a night school habit in your 20s, it's much easier to maintain. Like, it's really hard to do that when you've got young children. I'm very lucky that my kid has grown up, and I had years of not doing any study. But for me, academic work uses a different part of my brain to my day job or to anything else. And my daughter just says that I'm weird. So it's completely fine if everybody else thinks I'm weird. But I really enjoy the studying. I think whatever subject you study, it adds value to your day job, because it encourages you to think in a different way and it broadens your horizons. So I am doing 2 things at night school. I'm doing a master's in international film and television with the University of Hertfordshire, and I'm doing undergraduate French with the Open University.
What?
Yeah.
You just threw that at me? I thought it was just a one thing. Now it's 2 things. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, well, my original plan was to then try and combine them both and eventually do a PhD in French cinema. But I think I probably won't do that. I definitely want to do a PhD, but I've got some different ideas about that. My personal tutor for the masters, he did his PhD on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and he studied that in a business school. So he was looking at kind of the economy around the MCU. And I have an idea of doing something a little bit similar. So yeah, we'll see.
Oh my goodness, this conversation is getting more and more interesting. It's in danger of just going completely off tangent.
Like, who wants to talk about Salesforce when we could talk about Marvel?
Absolutely. I got my kids through the whole series. I got Disney, and through the lockdown, we just sat down because they're old enough to watch it now. They're 12. And the benefit of watching through it again, and we could talk about the motive, the intent, the human behavior that drives why people do things. Thanos is a great character, for example. But tell me about what's French film, what's that attracts you to think about wanting to do a PhD?
Well, French, I've always been rubbish at languages, and I hate the fact that I'm rubbish at languages. When I go abroad to work, I feel ashamed. It's such a classic English thing, isn't it, to be rubbish at languages? It's such a stereotype. And it's a stereotype that is true because, English people, we are kind of lazy about learning languages because we can afford to be, because everybody speaks English. And at school you learn a bit of language, and I was never good at it. Like, I just never had a knack for it, And so I've continuously tried to work at it and improve. And the main thing is confidence. I have zero confidence speaking in French. So my comprehension, my understanding is really good. And I just have to work at my speaking. And I'm hoping that studying it properly kind of will force me into doing that. That's the plan. And then I've always been a massive movie buff. A huge fan of movies. I've always watched a lot of films and been really, really interested in them. And, when I was a kid, that was, reviewing movies. That was something I was interested in, and always watched strange movies. I was a big fan of Movie Drome, which I don't know if it used to be like late night, Sunday night TV on BBC Two when I was a teenager. And Alex Cox, who's actually a movie director and now a lecturer in film in Denver University, I think, he used to present all kinds of strange old movies with a kind of talk about why he was showing that movie. So I've always loved film, and yes, it's a real treat to study it. But it's tough. It's quite rigorous academically. It is a master's. So I've got to write 20,000 word dissertation. There are a lot of essays to write, a lot of movies to watch. But this last term has included a lot of South American films and TV shows, which I was not familiar with. So it's been really good. Learned a lot.
Wow, how can I switch the topic back to Salesforce? But if I don't, we'll run out of time. Okay, with that lovely detour, let's bring it back to the topic. What I'm interested in is your leadership style, and I loved how you talk about your team and various places that you were at. So very different companies. So you just prior to IBM, you were at Presido. What was the kind of leadership style? How are you as a person, as a leader? Did it change throughout the different companies that you've worked at?
It's definitely changed a lot over the years. I mean, I was really young when I was first given kind of people management responsibility, and so had to learn a lot through instinct. And I think, to be honest, most leaders are instinctive. You don't learn at school or in university about how to be a leader. It's going to catch you by surprise at some point. Something's going to happen that you weren't expecting. So I think most folks are kind of instinctive. And I guess my instincts must have been reasonably sound because I was fairly effective. And so some core principles would be around treating others as I would want to be treated myself, but with an important caveat around that we don't all think alike. So what I might want might be different to what you want, but the important thing is to be thinking about how is the other person going to experience this, rather than what do I want to tell them, and that's an important kind of rule of thumb, I suppose, that I've always tried to live by. The other thing is to try and focus on being successful. What's the end game? And always trying to make sure that in every job, everybody understands how what they are doing connects to the aims of the organization. Because it doesn't really matter what job you're in, but that sense of belonging and how what you do matters. So whether that is somebody processing claims in an insurance company, or somebody who's on a call center job, or a salesperson or a consultant, they need to understand about how the decisions that they make, we all make thousands of decisions every day in our job, what those decisions mean to the big picture. Because otherwise, I think people get very bored and disconnected in their jobs, and that tends to be where issues arise usually. So those are principles that I've had. But then I was very, very lucky to stumble across some really good training a few years ago, and that's something I've used a lot with other people as well.
Can you share a bit about that training? What do you mean?
Yeah, so I actually was really lucky to get involved in that when I was at the Carbon Trust and National Energy Foundation. It's a small training company called Momentum Consultants, run by a guy called Ashley Bookman. So this is probably about 15 years ago. I went on a course, like our whole organization went on this course called Task Orientated Negotiation. And at first I was really confused about what this was about. It just wasn't landing with me the first couple of days. And then I began to get it, and it really opened my eyes. And what Ashley does is it's bordering on almost like therapy type work. He's using constructs and theories from psychology, but rather than explaining those things to people, his method of teaching is very experiential, right? So he doesn't stand at the front and talk about drama triangles or about the OK Corral. He doesn't deliver a lecture in those and ask people to think about it. It's very much about creating role plays and team kind of settings where people will dialogue on subjects and then review that. And then through that review, he and his team challenge people about their thinking, about the words that they use, about their approach. And that begins to uncover like all of these kind of almost like facepalm moments of, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that came across like that. Or of course the person sees it like that. And that's all wrapped up with lots of really good techniques about observing yourself and observing others and just thinking differently about the world that I've found really useful. And one of the things that I think is most useful about that is it creates a common set of language that you can use in your organization across all of the leadership, that how you talk about how you do your job as leaders and managers. And that really changes things. That makes it much easier to be effective. So I brought Ashley in to do work with all of the managers in Presido, and I think they would all talk about how valuable that work was, and that made a big difference, I think, to the culture there and to people's skills, and that they will take that with them for the future. And by being better leaders, you're actually almost by osmosis beginning to develop some of those skills and ways of working into the people that you're influencing, so that they are kind of more insightful as they grow in their careers. And that's very much what Ashley wants to do, is to kind of seed some of these bits of thinking around organizations to just help improve the quality of how people interact with each other, which is most powerful through leadership, because that's where people have most ability to do harm to other people potentially, but just in the way that we interact with each other day to day, even outside of those kind of management relationships.
So in terms of the this training and the style of leadership that you're talking about, do you see that that's something that is transferable to any kind of company, any kind of setting, any kind of culture, size, so on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, Pei, because it isn't just about leadership relationships either. Like I was saying, the very first course I went on with Ashley was about task-orientated negotiation. And so it's using those same theories in how you work with clients, right? Because anybody that's watching this, every company aspires to have these kind of partnership engagements with their clients. Everybody wants to have strategic conversations with them. They don't want it to be transactional. They don't want anything to be hidden. They want to be able to have these meaningful discussions and come to joint solutions with their clients. And all of that strategy is legitimate. Everybody that puts that out there really means it. Where there is a disconnect is around the ability to actually execute those conversations, because people from everywhere come into a conversation loaded with stuff, loaded with past experiences, with a sense of what's good or bad or right or wrong, with their agenda, what they feel that they shouldn't talk to the clients about, what they feel sensitive about, weaknesses, strengths. And all of that means that those conversations are loaded, and they take away from the ability to have those clear, transparent, strategic, partner-related kind of conversations. And I guess the development that I've had, and that hopefully I've given to all these other people, means that you have an ability just to wipe all of that away, right? And to have really grown up, and this is where the kind of psychology comes into it. Fundamentally, I'm okay, you're okay, as organizations, as human beings, as the nature of the conversation. That means that there is, nothing that cannot be discussed. It's purely about how we talk about these things. And that is probably one of my biggest strengths in the work. And I almost feel like I'm cheating, because anybody could have that strength if they just have the confidence to be able to release so much of this other stuff that we all carry around with us all the time, and to be able to just have a really grown up, clear conversation, and to appreciate the agendas and issues that the other person's bringing, and actually enable them to navigate through that, instead of either treating that as something to be beaten or broken or defeated or worked around. Then it's more about enabling those things to be solved and actually addressed. And those are, I guess, that's the skills that I've taken from that, and that's really important in how you work on projects, I think.
What are your thoughts around why people aren't able to kind of like release that and have those sort of conversations?
I think that is just the nature of human beings, but particularly human beings in organizations. There are a real mixture of reasons. There are as many reasons as there are people. There are some people who've got to a certain level and position in their company, and they have a belief about the things that enabled them to get there. And then that belief system drives how they behave and what their values are and how they talk to people. Then there are other people who have, are under pressure maybe to achieve a specific outcome, and that could drive them into some mal thinking about how to get there. There are so many different reasons why people are like that, often for benevolent reasons. There are so many people that think their job as leaders of either people or customers is to take care of others. But the trouble is that taking care also comes from a place of, I'm okay, you're not okay. It's like, I have some power, you need looking after, you need, no, we're all equals, we're all grown-ups, we're all the same, right? You need to ditch all of that kind of thinking, because it's actually really not helpful. It skews your thinking, which then that old saying about how, your thoughts become your words, become your actions, right? And if your thoughts are, I have to take care of somebody, that is really disempowering to that other person right from the get-go. And if you have a person on the other end of that who's sensitive to that, who finds that triggering, then that's going to lead to a clash really quickly. And it just is, that people don't actively think about that. That's all happening in the background without them even being aware of it. And I see that a lot on Salesforce projects, where consultants feel that they are caretakers for the customer. Right? So, we better take care of this for the customer. And then they rush into this kind of hidden decision making that makes the projects go off track. They're trying to do the right thing. And early in my career, I've done similar things where we try and do the right thing, but that's never the right thing. The right thing is always to talk about it, not to make paternalistic people or other companies.
Penny, I have to say, you come across as such a together person. You have your everything is under control. Can you share a situation where you've encountered crisis and looking back, you think, oh, I could have handled that a little bit better? Do you have any of those crises?
So many crises, so many crises. It's constant. And as I'm getting older, it's almost, this is not something I'd advocate to people, but almost the worse the crises are you go through, kind of the worse it has to be before it qualifies as a crisis anymore. So, and that builds great resilience. And I think for young people, especially coming into their careers, quite small things can seem like a really big dramatic crisis. And as the years go on, that you moderate your own expectation of actually what disaster is and what risk is. And I think that is something that you just get from age and experience. But in one of my very first jobs, probably actually my first job, I was in a situation where I was leading a consortium to bid for money for a project. And I was very young, very naive, and we did a great job in bidding for this project. And the funding body called me up and said, we're going to award you the project, but we're not going to give you all of the money that you asked for. We're going to give you like 2/3 of it. And I was just like, oh, amazing. Yes, definitely. Of course, we'll take it. And I was just so happy that we'd won this. I was over the moon, and I was kind of busily telling everyone, yeah, we've won. And then as the rest of the consortium found out that we didn't have all of the money, we'd only won the 2/3 of it. Actually, I started to get all of this feedback from everybody going, well, what have you said yes for? If we'd know that, we would have said no. We'd have said, no, we can't do it. We can't just, it's too much of a compromise. We'll have to compromise on this, and it'll be a moral compromise on that, and this would not be right. And actually, there was a whole debate that needed to be had about whether we would do the project under those circumstances or not, that literally hadn't even gone through my mind. I had only seen the positive about it. And my personal approach would have been, right, we'll figure out a way of doing it for that money, which was valid opinion, but not the only opinion. And that really was like a big slap in the face as a mistake. Like, I had some big fallout from that mistake. And what it taught me is that the communication is the most important thing, regardless of wrong, right decision making, regardless of whether people's opinions are just way outrageously inappropriate. That's almost secondary. The fact is that you actually need to have the conversation, and that was my big mistake, and I learned a lot from that.
As you were going through that, how did you manage things? Because as I'm listening, I'm thinking, I'll probably wig out during that time as soon as I found out. How did you, that period must have been quite tough. Did you have any support, or was it just you trying to wade through all these people coming back to you and asking all these questions?
Yeah, it was very lonely and very scary. And that's the other thing that I've learned as I've got older, is not to let yourself get in that situation so much. So at that time, I felt hugely ashamed about it. I felt it, that was when I was, before I'd kind of learned about anything. So at that point in my life, my self-esteem and my job were really knitted up together. And actually, it was having my baby completely changed that, right? Like that I feel like that was also very lucky, because that forced that break. Whereas a lot of people have to work over a long time to separate their self-esteem from their career and their work. And it's difficult to do. So at that time, all of that negativity about that decision on that project, that felt like it was about me. It's not about me at all. It was purely about the work and the decision making. But at the time, it felt like it was about me. And that made me really upset. And, and I'm really good at being tough and doing stiff upper lip and battling on. But those kind of experiences when I was young they really hurt. And I think a lot of young people particularly struggle with that. You know, when you're in your early 20s and you want desperately to be successful, any knockbacks hurt, jobs you don't get, things that go wrong. And you also have that tendency just to work all the hours, to say yes to everything, to never argue. That's going to catch up with you someday. And it's also not actually the route to success. Like, that is the route to burnout. It's definitely not the route to success. And the way that you add value by challenging things and by suggesting different ways of doing things, and by that core separation of you are not your work, that is something that's really difficult for a lot of people to learn. And I only learnt it because, you know, I woke up one morning with a baby and she was not prepared to let me be my work anymore. She was like, no, stick work where the sun doesn't shine. I am you now. Everything is going to depend on how loud I scream, and forget everything else that used to define who you were. And that was, in a way, very fortunate. And I had this chat recently with a girl in my team, and she was like, so Penny, are you telling me that I should go and get pregnant? And I was like, no, that is definitely not the solution to the problem. Not having the baby was my kind of way around this. It's the harder job to do is to figure it out for yourself. But that's what everybody needs to try and do, is to find that separation. And actually the studying is a good way of doing that, because it's another outlet for who you are that is not your job. And that's so important, I think.
Wow. So here's a question. If you had a time machine and you could go back and tell the younger Penny what not to do, would you?
That is such an interesting point. And that's actually something I've given some thought to. There is a really terrible Richard Curtis movie called About Time. I really don't like that movie at all. But one of the interesting things about that is that when this young man goes back in time to change things, an unintended consequence of that is that his kids turn out to be different, right? And I think that would be the thing that would put me off going back in time, because I have thought before, if I could go back in time, there are things I would love to change about the way my life is now that I know in hindsight. You know, there are people I would be with or not be with that I could go back in time and I could correct that. But if I did that, I wouldn't have my daughter that I have now. And that would be such a big deprivation for me, and also for the world, because we wouldn't have her in it. And so I think I wouldn't, actually, because of her, I wouldn't change anything.
Just on that particular example you gave around consortium project, how about that? Just going back.
Oh, if I was just going to change that.
Yes, just that thing. Because what I'm trying to draw out is, what were the lessons that you learned from that experience that was so big and so valuable that it was worth the suffering and the pain of going through the mistake?
Oh, everything, Pay. I wouldn't change any of that. You know, I'd go back and have all my disasters, all my conversations that went badly, all the mistakes that I made. I would continue to do them all, really, because I learned something from all of them. I think there is one, actually, there was a conversation I had a couple of years ago, and where I went against my instincts as to how to have the conversation. So one of the most difficult things that you ever need to do as a leader is when you have to dismiss somebody from their job, right? And there are myriad circumstances where that needs to occur. Everything from a big redundancy program to, you know, gross misconduct. And the reality is that most situations fall somewhere in between that, where maybe you know, your business has declined and you need to lose headcount, or you're having a reorganization, or somebody is just not performing in their role at the level they need to. Maybe somebody's been on a performance improvement program and it hasn't worked out and you have to let them go. Those are all incredibly difficult conversations. And I used to think that would get easier as I got older. I used to think that the more of those you did, the better you'd get at them and the less that they would hurt you. But in fact, it turns out I was wrong about that. The older that you get, the worse they get. And I think they get worse because you become more aligned with the other person. It's easier to think how much that would screw up your life if you were on the other side of that table. And lots of leaders make the mistake of prioritizing their own ego in that conversation. They kind of want the person being dismissed to feel sorry for them, or to feel the pain of dismissing someone. My instinct is not that at all. I want them to be angry with me. I want them to hate me about it. I want them to feel mad about it because I'm the right person for them to dump that on. I don't want them to feel mad with themselves. This is a learning opportunity, not an opportunity to hate themselves. Like they need to find somewhere to put that anger and that upset that isn't on themselves, that isn't going home and being angry and upset with their wife and their kids or their family, certainly isn't pouring it into self-loathing. It needs to be a chance for them to be able to look in a really task-orientated way at like, what went wrong? What could I have done differently? What will I take away from this to do differently? What's my strategy now for how I get my next job and how this doesn't happen to me again? That's what I want them to walk away feeling. And that means that they probably need to get all that anger and upset out of their system and have a really good place to direct that to. And that should be at the business, at me, at the rationale for why we're losing them. Right? And this one time, I didn't do that. I went with the strategy my colleague evoked, which was much more, oh, this is so sad. And, it's just not quite working. And, really, we're so sorry and all of that stuff. And that the conversation itself went really well. And the person was like saying all the right things. They were saying, oh, I totally understand. I know how hard this is for you. And, I understand what you mean and why it's not working. And then they got angry 2 weeks later. Right? And then when they were angry, it was irrational anger. They felt like I'd tricked them when I'd fired them. And they struggled to get past it. And that's what I realized happens when you have the conversation that way, that it's like there's something slightly dishonest about it. It's much, much better to be direct, to be task orientated. This isn't about you, the person. This isn't about me, the person. This is about this situation, this set of facts. This is the only choice that we are making. And I'm being really clear with you. A, B, and C are going to happen because of D, E, and F. This is what you can do about it. This is what will happen next. And then all that anger comes out there and then, and it's dealt with and they're over it. Whereas by being the whole, so sorry, but, and trying to bring them along and have them share in your decision making, it just extends the pain. And I actually think for that guy, it probably took him months to get over that. And I really regret that. And I would go back and do that differently. And I would go back and change that and do it my way and not have it be like that. Because that kind of over emotional stuff, that wrapping things in us as human beings, it's not fair. Because then all of those kind of social norms about not hurting other people's feelings come out in the way that the person responds to it. And it's not fair to load that on them when they're in a really difficult situation. And so that would be the one thing I'd go back and do differently, actually.
The fact that you say that it doesn't get easier as you grow older. Right, let's follow that line of thought. What does get easier as you grow older?
That is a great question. I think what gets easier is you get more confident, for sure. So I'm more likely now to call things out earlier that are going a bit wrong. I'm getting much better at having that confidence of not just letting things run and take their course, but of saying, I think we need to talk about this, or I think we need to put that on the table for discussion, or I think where you've got that as green, it probably is amber and we probably need to talk about it. Or if that's a risk you foresee in a few months, we should talk about it right now. And I think that having the confidence to spot those things and to call them out early is the thing that definitely gets easier. That's the main thing I would say. And also, as you get older and more experienced, if you've grown as a person in the right direction, then becoming task orientated and making it not about your feelings gets easier and easier. The trouble is that what's difficult is that you're working with more and more people who've grown the exact opposite direction, where their feelings have become more and more and more and more associated with work, and they're more and more sensitive. And those are quite difficult people to work with. But there are always ways around everything.
Talk to me about your values growing up. Has any of them changed?
That's an interesting question. Our values. We weren't a particularly values-loaded family. So, we weren't, there was no religious morality or anything like that. And I think having had some difficult situations early on meant that the values that we had were really distilled down to like minimum viable product level of values, right? And I think that has probably changed a little bit for me, but I've probably kept a lot of those core values. So I suppose one of my core values is not to particularly have any values, because the problem with having values is that then you're setting yourself up into opposition to somebody else. So for every value that you hold, somebody else is going to hold the opposite one, right? And then that is just incredibly polarizing. So I suppose my core value is that all values have some rightness and some wrongness. There is nothing that is truly right or wrong. Everything is dependent on the circumstances. And I try not to hold any really strong values and have respect for everybody. So then that respect becomes like my core value. Respect and trying to not make any assumptions becomes my core values. And I remember when Lottie was a very little girl, actually, and my boyfriend was getting really angry with somebody else about something, or had really lost his temper with somebody. And she said, he is just being himself. And that's what I realized is so powerful, is that when you see the world and other people like that, then you are incredibly resilient to being hurt by other people. Because when you understand that everybody else's behavior is about them and not about you, it makes you a lot less egotistical, but it also makes it just an awful lot easier to live in the world, right? Because you're not constantly thinking, oh, this person's doing this to me, or they've done that to me. Nobody's doing anything to anybody else, like in that sense. It's all about them. And, at the massive level, even this whole Russia-Ukraine thing, it's not really about Ukraine. Like, that's just the PR. It's about Putin and it's about Russia. It's about them and what his own politics, probably incredibly local, probably incredibly down to the 10 people he spends the most time with, is probably really the whole driver for this whole thing. And that's true from the micro to the macro level, that most people are driven by what's going on inside them rather than what's around. And that's, I guess, my core value.
So if you'll allow me to share what I think your values are based on the conversations that, the last two conversations we've had, it sounds like you've got a very strong value about what's right. So you sharing that story about having to let someone go, there is a sense of justice, what's right for the other person. There's respect, seems to be one of your core values. the other ones that came forward was how independent you are, and how unwilling you are to compromise that in a lot of things that you do, and freedom as well. So these are just a few that I've gleaned from you in those conversations. And you to say, this is my observation, that you don't have core values because you believe everyone has that you don't want to be in opposition to other people, also tells me about the fact that you are so, I can't find a word, but not collaborative, but that everyone is equal. Just from everything that you've said, that you're very inclusive in everything you do, and that is quite unusual, because a lot of people, when I ask them what their values are, they come up with quite a few. The things that are truly important to them. But it sounds like when I ask you the question, you're thinking about the other person whose value might be opposing to yours, and not wanting to upset them, offend them, if you're on the opposite end. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, definitely. I think freedom probably, I would say, is a value of mine for sure. I think justice is more complex because justice is very much in the eye of the beholder. And one person's justice is another person's, it's like one person's terrorist is the next person's freedom fighter, right? And it's very true with justice. And I'm actually writing my essay this term's course in my MA has been screen violence. And I'm writing my essay on the last episode of The Handmaid's Tale. And I don't want to kind of give it away, but it's very violent, very bloody. And I'm writing my essay as a discussion about whether that was a capitulation to the values of this repressive regime in Gilead, or whether it was an act of freedom and emancipation, because you could interpret that incident either way. And my interpretation is that it was an act of freedom and emancipation, but that is up for debate. A lot of critics have said the opposite, that the people involved in that act lost their moral high ground by committing this violent act, which is an interesting debate. And I think while I have my view on it, I see that debate. And I think that that's true of everything with justice. I think there's a good, it's always up for debate.
I'm loving where this conversation is going, because I'm a history buff. But I don't have where I get my information from, because I used to drive lots to go to client site, 3-4 hours to Manchester and Wales, and I put the teaching company lectures on Rome and the Greco-Roman history and all sorts. And what I have come to understand is history and the concept of justice and who's right and who won and all of that is very, as you say, very up for debate. And I can't remember where I read, but like if there's an event happening, as you say, the last scene of The Handmaid's Tale, which I haven't watched, you could put a lens on somebody and step into their shoes, and their view and their opinion about what's happening is vastly different from somebody else in exactly the same scene, because of the background, context of the character and what's happened to them. And so, as you say, justice is so nuanced and context driven. But what I was trying to get at was, you had a strong belief in what was right. And it sounds like that's something that's driven a lot of your decision-making process. Do you feel that that's true?
Yes, I guess it's maybe about in the circumstances. I don't think that there are kind of big rights and wrongs, but I think the objective in any interaction is about what's the outcome that you want to achieve, and how do you best get to there, rather than what makes me feel good, or what's going to make them feel good, or what's going to get through this conversation the easiest way. It's much more about kind of what's the end goal. And even if that's something really difficult, that's the thing that you need to talk about, rather than we all go to so many meetings that don't talk about anything real, and especially on projects with clients. I think we've all seen those projects where you go week after week after week after week with a green status report, or maybe green and a bit amber, and everything's fine, and then all of a sudden it's totally not fine, and actually it never was fine. And it's just that nobody really talked about it, because what was the purpose of that meeting? To get in and out cleanly, or to talk about the difficult stuff? And that's where, for me, I guess your point about rightness is that I would say, well, the right thing, the real purpose of that meeting is to talk about the difficult stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's not so much that I know what's the right outcome from that, or I have strong feelings about that. It's just that I think there's no point having the meetings if you're not going to talk about the really meaningful stuff. And on those kind of things, I suppose I do have quite a strong sense of what's the right thing to do, rather than what's the right outcome necessarily. And I can be quite brave about being the only person that will say, hang on a minute, but what about this? And open up the difficult conversation. And the difficult thing when you do that is to then not being left as the person who's kind of responsible for it. It's trying to enable a conversation. And that's probably one of my weaknesses. I'm probably too liable to end up taking all responsibility when I don't really want it.
I am very mindful of your time. I want to be respectful, but this conversation is so interesting. I'm just going to throw something else in there. It's more for my curiosity, and it's slightly controversial. So, feel free to you don't have to answer. So the topic of diversity and inclusion, and growing up in Malaysia, where affirmative action is something that is reality, and me being Chinese, it's kind of second-class citizen to the local Malays and the Muslims, and so that's a reality that I kind of grew up in. And in the creation of organizations and things like that, there is we have to have a quota. So they've got a quota for universities, and on the board, if you want to set up a company, that there's a race quota, as an example. So I'm coming from a country where we're seeing things from the other direction, and I come here, and it's great to have active inclusion and diversity as a great topic to give opportunities to those, from the non-white, slightly less privileged background. I can see that, but my personal feeling is that a job should go to the person who's best qualified. So if you were hiring and there were some policies around diversity and inclusion, how would you kind of make the decision? Would you follow the line of the policy, or would you get the best person for the job, even if it doesn't fall within that policy? I don't know if I'm...
That is such a tough challenge that so many of us are facing all the time right now, about how to do diversity well. It is a very, very difficult question. And I think affirmative action is brilliant in like a big bang of suddenly making a transformation to an organization or an industry or the world. And if everybody could just all be aligned and we'll just boom, all do it on the same day, then actually that would change things for the better. But the problem with it, when it's done by different organizations or different countries or in a staggered way, is that then all that happens is you create a two-tier system within that company or within that team, and you end up with a kind of caste system, and you end up with people being referred to as the diversity candidate or the diversity hire, and that then really diminishes their power and makes things worse than if you hadn't had the affirmative action in the beginning. And those are things that you can't just train everybody else to solve that problem, because you can train them to say the right stuff. You can't train them to think and believe the right stuff. That takes decades of work to move people to that place. So I think it is very difficult. I would agree the fundamental idea that you want the best person for the job. I think the problem that we have is that we then set up ways of working that advantage specific people over others, so that then the criteria we may set make it much easier for one group of people to meet those than they do another group of people. We also are not very good at looking at facts instead of the way people present themselves. So, men are much better at basically lying in their interviews. A man will come in and he doesn't even think he's lying because it's what he's been taught to do since he was 3 years old. It's not lying, it's bigging yourself up, it's being confident, it's being, self-assured, and it's telling the other person what they want to hear. That's not lying. So they'll come in and they'll big up the job that they've done and talk about the brilliant role they had. Women who since 3 years old have been brought up to be very respectful of others, minimize themselves, push other people forward, will talk about the exact same situation as being, oh, what the team did, what this person did, what that person did, and they'll minimize it. A man will round up their sales figure, the woman will round it down, right? And so if you're comparing like for like, then it would appear that the man is the best person for the job, but that is not true. That is just skin deep appearances, and that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And I think that the thing we need to work on is to enable women to beat men at that game, right? Because actually, I think if we can upskill women to defeat some of that stuff, we can kick their ass. Like, honestly, women with the range of skills, the extra perception that women have, that is not genetic or anything like that, but that we have to have in order to stay and survive at work, that we can use that to our advantage. And I think that's true for so many different groups. And it makes, until we change, until we have more leaders who are more diverse, who can see through that stuff, and until we can enable minority groups to use their skills for their success, that the trouble with that picking the best person for the job is it's always skewed to the kind of the group with the most power to begin with. And that's decades, generations it's going to take to shift that, which, it's not cool. We want to do that much sooner.
I like that answer. Thank you for that. It's a much bigger problem, as you say, in terms of countrywide, governments having initiatives to put people on the similar playing field of those maybe minorities and women's and returning mums and things like that. So that's one prong to attack it. And the other one, I guess, is from the recruitment side, is to dig much deeper into the candidates to see if how they're representing themselves are correct and accurate. And maybe the third one is from an organization point of view to say, are we willing to invest in someone, maybe a woman who has not had the same opportunities as her counterpart, and help accelerate and augment her strengths, so that maybe in a year's time she would surpass the male counterpart. So that's really good. Thank you for helping to clarify that, because that's something that I've thought about for a long time, but unable to have that open conversation with a lot of people, because I feel, coming from Malaysia, I feel that we could do better by being more meritocratic. And it just was a conversation around race, around capability, that wasn't something that I could have that open conversation. So thank you so much for that. This has been such a fantastic hour with you, and I wish we could have more. Maybe we can have more when you have more time. So I do appreciate this time that you're spending with me today, Penny.
Thanks so much, Pei. It's lovely to chat to you. I agree, I could chat to you about this stuff all day.